Today we're going to cover a lot of the aspects of parking area modeling. This is going to include everything from setting up the parking lots and the spaces and the routes to looking at parking specific evaluations and graphic parameters. We're also going to take a look at a built-in parking lot creator that we can use to also help us automatically create multiple parking spaces at once. So within Vissim, you can model the main types of parking spaces. So this will include everything from parallel parking to also diagonal parking and perpendicular parking. And the two items shown here, the diagonal parking and the perpendicular parking, these are what we can help create using that parking lot creator, which we'll talk about a bit later. And for all of these, the objects involved with parking modeling include these overall parking lots themselves. So you'll see these are shown as the blue boxes here. And the parking lots can also contain spaces. And each space is kind of defined with a line in between here. So you can see this parking lot we've got set up here has a total of 4 different spaces. And then in addition to the parking lot object, we'll also need a parking lot routing decision. And this will take any of the vehicles traveling on a static route, and as the vehicles cross this parking routing decision, they're going to determine whether or not they need to park in this particular lot. So again, these are really the two main objects that we'll be talking about today, the parking lots, which are made up of spaces, and then also the parking lot routing decision. So the main parking lot objects can all be created by selecting the parking lots option from the network object toolbar. And you can either right-click on a link and then select the add new parking lot option from the context menu, or you can also just press Control and right-click, and that will automatically drop a parking lot onto a link for you. And once that new parking lot is created, you can access the parking lot information by editing that object. And when you go to edit the object, this parking lot window shown here will pop up. And up here in the upper left-hand corner, this is where you can set up the parking lot number. You'll see the link information as well, so what link it's on, as well as the location on the link. And then you can also set up the overall parking lot length. And then for any of the lots that we want to use for parking purposes, we'll just want to make sure we have the option for real parking spaces selected. And then directly below that, we can also set up any evaluation groups. And these will allow you to group certain parking lots together so that way they can be evaluated as a whole. And we're going to talk more about creating these parking evaluation groups and adding parking lots to them a bit later. And once the main configuration is done, you can then select the Parking Spaces tab to update information about that space itself. So in here, you'll see the first option is for the actual lane location for that parking lot, as well as the length of each space. And again, this space length is going to be particularly important if you're looking at modeling any parallel parking spots. So this will determine how long each of those spaces are within the overall parking lot itself. And then next, you can define the period of time that a vehicle will block a lane while it's completing any of those parallel parking maneuvers. So this in itself is optional. So you can see here in this case, this drop-down is blank. So you won't have to include it if you're modeling any of the diagonal or perpendicular spaces. But if you are modeling any parallel parking lots and you want to include a blocking time, you can just select that drop-down and choose a time distribution. And the parking direction itself is going to define how those vehicles drive into and out of a space. So this can either be set to forward and then reverse if the vehicles are going to pull in and then back out. Or you can also set this to forward and then forward if you just want the vehicles to pull in and then they can just pull out the front, like in a parallel parking scenario. And then next we have the minimum gap time. And this is just the amount of time that a vehicle in a parking space is going to look at as the vehicles are traveling in the major flow. So that vehicle kind of sitting in that parking space is going to look at that major flow and determine the amount of time between two vehicles in the major flow. And then once that, if that minimum gap time has been met, that way the vehicle in the parking space will be allowed to leave and actually back out and complete its maneuver. And then we also have a speed value here, and this will be the speed that vehicles are going to use as they are reversing out of a parking space. So if you are using this forward reverse option, then the vehicles will take this reverse speed into account as they're leaving. And then finally, we have the direction change time for spaces that are set again to that forward reverse setting. And this is going to represent the amount of time that vehicles stop after they have finished reversing out of a space until they begin to drive forward. And both this attribute and the reverse driving speed attribute can both significantly impact the traffic flow along the main driving aisle. So that's just something to keep in mind if you are going to change these values from the default, that this can really impact the all the vehicles in the main traffic flow. And then here in the last tab, we have some selected parameters. And this is where you can define some additional attributes for those parking lot objects. And first up here, we have different open hours that we can set for that parking lot to be in use, as well as a maximum parking time that's allowed. And if this particular lot is ever closed for a portion of the simulation time, then as long as that lot is closed, no vehicles will ever park there. So even if a vehicle is driving and hits one of those routing decisions, what it's going to do is check and make sure that that particular lot is open before it will be allowed to park there. Otherwise, if all of those lots are closed, the vehicle will just continue driving. And then you can also set different attraction factors on both the parking lots and the spaces. And the higher the value is in here, the more attractive a space or a lot will be. And you can also create more of a linear change in attractiveness as well across all of those parking spaces by entering different values for the first space in the parking lot and then also the last space in the parking lot. So this is something you can use if you're doing any of that parallel parking modeling and you want to set maybe some of the outside, some of the outer spaces to be a bit more attractive. In here you can set that attractiveness factor so that way the vehicles will be more likely to park in one of those spaces. And then there's also a parking fee option within this section. However, this one is only relevant for parking lots that are using that zone connector or the abstract parking lot for dynamic assignment. So this will not be used for any of the real parking spaces. All right, so now that we've covered the parking lot objects, we can take a look at the routing decisions that we're going to use to actually get those vehicles to the spaces. So if you select the vehicle routes option from the network objects toolbar, there'll be a little drop-down icon you can select here. And from there, you can choose the option for a parking lot. You'll just want to make sure that you've got that option selected. And then from here, you can either use that context menu if you want to right-click and then choose the option to add new parking routing decision. And that's going to go ahead and place this first routing decision start point. Again, this start point will be where those vehicles, once they hit that routing decision, they're going to evaluate whether or not they'll need to park in this particular lot. And then the other option for placing that start point is if you just press Control and then right-click, and you can just drop that routing decision start point directly on the link itself. In either case, from here, you'll then, you can left-click to place the parking lot object, place that routing decision on the object for the parking lot. And then that's going to place kind of that blue endpoint again and assign this lot to this routing decision. And then from here, if you did have multiple parking spaces, like maybe you're doing some of those diagonal or the perpendicular spaces, You can also click multiple times on different parking lots if you want those all to be included within this one routing decision. And the parking lot routing decisions also have a few key attributes associated with them as well. So if you open up that parking routing decision list, in here you'll be able to see the position of that decision. And then you can also see the allowed vehicle type. By default, all of these will be checked. So this will always take all vehicles into account for this parking decision. But if you want, you can uncheck this, and then you can define only allowed vehicle classes as well in the box to the right. You can also define the parking rate, which is going to be the percentage of vehicles that will be assigned to this particular parking lot. And then also the parking duration, which is just the amount of time that vehicles are going to dwell in that parking lot. And this parking duration is going to use another time distribution. So if you just click on, there'll be a little arrow here as well that you can click on, and then you can choose a time distribution. And if you do need to add any other time distributions, you can do that all through the base data menu underneath the distributions. There'll be a section there for different time distributions that you can add. And then finally, we also have the full occupancy behavior here. And when you open up the routing decision list by default, you'll probably notice that this attribute is not shown by default. So you'll just want to go to the little wrench icon over here, and then you can add this full occupancy behavior. And what this is going to do is basically define what's going to happen to the vehicles when all of the parking spaces are full. So you can either have this be set to drive on, which in that case, the vehicles are just going to continue on their route. They'll just keep going on their static route if they notice that everything is full. Or the other option is to have the vehicles wait. And so they're going to, in that case, wait until that space is free, and then they can park there. And then also within this parking routing decision list, by default, you'll see the child list here has been set to parking routes, which will all show up in the window here on the right-hand side. And in here, you can just go through and you can see all the different parking lots that have been assigned to this particular routing decision. And you can always cycle through these. You can use the arrow keys to just quickly to go through each of these if you want to see what that routing decision looks like. So you can see here the path itself will be highlighted in blue. And if you ever do need to change this particular path location, you can do this just like you would for any other static route, where you can right click and place some of those anchor points, and then you can just click and drag that routing decision to the desired path. And if you ever do need to add additional parking lots to a routing decision that you've already created, you can also do this by highlighting that particular routing decision you want to add the lots to. And then you can just press Control and right click to select those parking lots. And in this case, you'll see a little plus icon will be displayed next to the mouse. And then once you've got those added, it'll add a new line item within that routing decision. So this can be really useful if you've done some initial setup for your parking lots, and then if you ever add in any additional parking lots that you still want to be part of that overall routing decision, no worries, you can always come back in here and then add any additional ones by just doing this Control right click and then selecting all those different parking lots. All right, so now that we've gone through those required objects and adding those in a more manual way, let's take a look at another automated way that we can use to generate, in particular, the perpendicular or diagonal parking spaces. So if you take a look at the network editor window, you'll see that there's a toolbar over here on the left-hand side. And this has a few different options for doing some more automatic creation of objects. And in here, there'll be a little parking lot icon where you can choose to create a car park. And once you have that selected, there'll be a little window here that'll open up that says Create Car Park. And from here, you can just go to the particular link location, and you'll see that the mouse will have a line will show up, kind of where that parking lot's going to start. And then from here, you can just left-click to place that initial location. And then you can just drag the mouse to the end location, and then you can just left-click again to define that stop point. And you can see as you drag the mouse, the parking spaces themselves will be shown in the network editor window. And then once you've placed, again, that start and that end point, from here, there's going to be a whole bunch of additional attributes that are going to show up in this window here on the left-hand side. And this is going to contain data for the driving aisles, and also for the parking spaces themselves, and then also for the parking routes. So the section up here at the very top, again, this is for some of the drive aisle information. So in here, you can set up the display type for the links, as well as the link behavior type. You can also define if there's any dead end that you want to set up. You can choose that in here. And then you can also choose different parking accessibility options for both the main direction and the opposing direction. So this would allow you to kind of turn on or off different parking spaces being accessible from that drive aisle. So in this case, if we take a look at this northbound link here, we could turn, if we turned off the opposing direction, essentially that would remove access to the parking spaces here on the left. So that way the vehicles in the main drive aisle would only have access to those parking spaces on the main drive aisle on the right-hand side. So this will just allow you, again, to just further configure who has access to which type of spaces. And then the larger middle section here will allow you to update the parking space information. In here, you can choose to create parking spaces either on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, or for both together. You can also set up, again, some link-specific behavior types and the display type. And then we'll start to get into some more space-specific information. So in here, you can set the angle, the length, as well as the width. And then in addition, you can also set the speed approach distribution. So this will be the speeds vehicle will use as they're approaching those parking lots. And again, here we'll see that speed reversal setting, as well as those attraction factors and the evaluation groups. And so again, a lot of these are kind of repeat characteristics and attributes that we saw within that parking lot object. So this parking lot creator will essentially take these settings we have set up in here and just set all of those for us automatically within those parking lots. And then at the very bottom is where we can update information regarding the parking routing decisions and the parking routes. By default, a new parking routing decision will be created, but you can choose to adjust that here if you don't want to create one of those routing decisions. Maybe you've already created a group of parking lots and you just want to continue to use that other routing decision. You can turn that off in these options here. If you are going to create a parking routing decision, you can also set up the parking rate as well as that parking duration. And although all that configuration can be done within those tables, a lot of this can also be done in the GUI itself. And this is sometimes a bit easier, especially if you have any background imagery that you're trying to kind of map up against and kind of fine-tune the space, location, and information. So within the GUI, once you've got this main group of spaces created, you can first choose to delete any individual parking spaces by pressing this X button. And when you press the X, you'll notice that space itself is going to take on have a hatched pattern. You can always bring those spaces back if you do notice, oh, actually, I do want that. You can just press the little X again, and that'll bring that space back. You can also rotate the spaces in the GUI as well. If you notice, there'll be one of the corners that kind of has a darker highlight. So you can grab this corner and then you can just click and drag the mouse, and that's just going to rotate those spaces for you. And then you can also hover over the end of the parking space, and you'll notice the mouse icon will turn into a double arrow icon. And then once you have that, you can then just click and drag again to either lengthen or shorten those spaces as needed. And as you're dragging, the space itself will update in the GUI, so you can kind of see how that changes against any of those background images you're trying to match up to. And then similar to the length, you can also hover over to the side of the parking spaces as well, and then you can click and drag if you want to increase or decrease that space width. And then if you ever notice that maybe you've created too many spaces or too few spaces when you were initially placing those start and end points, you can always click the kind of this endpoint again, and then you can just click and drag that, and that will either increase if you drag it further out or decrease the number of spaces that are shown if you drag it downwards. And then you can also set up any of the dead ends as well. So there are a few different arrow types that you'll notice here. The ones at the very end will set any of those dead ends, while these inner arrows will deal with that accessibility that we talked about earlier. So this will kind of turn on or off the kind of allowed spaces that vehicles can travel to as they're driving in that main aisle. So again, you can do a lot of this configuration either in that main configuration window on the left-hand side, or you can use the GUI in here. Again, the GUI is really nice to use it, especially if you've got some background imagery you're trying to align to, just because you can easily see how everything is kind of mapped out. All right, so then once you've got everything configured and kind of aligned and set up the way that you want it, you can then press, there'll be a little green check mark in that window on the left-hand side that you can just choose to kind of complete everything and finalize the process. And then once you've got that checked and configured, what's going to happen is that Vissim is going to take all of the information you've configured on the left-hand side in here and going to convert it into all of the objects required for the parking lot modeling shown here on the right-hand side. So as a part of this process, you'll see each of the individual parking lot links are going to be added, as well as all of these single space parking lots. So again, by default, this is going to depend on what the length of the space is that you've got set up. But in this case, the parking lot itself will be equal to that parking lot link length as well. And then all of the relevant connectors will also be added. So this will include connectors from the drive aisles. So if you're allowing vehicles to turn into these spaces on the left-hand side from here, you'll get these left turn connectors in place, as well as the right turn connectors in place. You can see those here. And then you'll also get a smaller connector with a smaller radius, and that's going to be used by vehicles as they're reversing out of a space. So if you allow all of the accessibility options, at the end, you'll essentially get 3 different connectors tied to each of these spaces. And then in addition, you'll also get the reduced speed areas placed on all of those connectors for you. And then again, by default, if you leave those default settings, you'll also get a couple of parking lot routing decisions, and each of those are going to have a couple of parking routes located in them for those vehicles to access the parking lot. And these are going to really be all the elements that you need to run a simulation. So at this point, if you've already got kind of the vehicle inputs and the static routes in place, you'll be all set and you can actually start to run the simulation and see vehicles parking at this point. One other thing that you'll see as the simulation is running is that all of the priority rules will also be automatically placed in the network to manage any of those conflicts as well for any of the vehicles pulling in or pulling out to avoid them from conflicting with any vehicles in the drive aisles. So this parking lot creator can be a huge time saver, especially if you're creating a large quantity of spaces, if you're doing any larger lot modeling or parking garage modeling. All right, so now that we've covered all of those objects, now let's take a look at some of the requirements that have to be met in order for a vehicle to actually park in a space. So the very first thing the vehicles are going to check for is to make sure that that parking lot is open. Again, that parking lot open attribute is going to be set on the parking lot object itself. So we just have to make sure that that time is allowed and that the vehicles can actually park during that particular time. The routing decision must also be allocated to accept that particular vehicle class. So again, if you've got the all vehicle types selected, then all the vehicles will get it, should be able to park. Again, if you further refine that, the vehicles are just going to check when they pass that routing decision to see if their vehicle class is allowed. The parking space must also be long enough as well to fully accommodate that vehicle, along with a little extra buffer room. And then from here, the parking space will also need to be free, which in Vissim, it will either mean the space must be completely unoccupied, so no vehicle in the space at all. Or if there is a vehicle in the space, then there isn't another vehicle already assigned to that space. And again, all the vehicles will make these decisions as they cross this parking routing decision. So when they cross this decision, again, they're just going to go through kind of this list of conditions and make sure that the lot is open, that their vehicle class is allowed, that there's enough space for them in that spot, and that also that parking space is free. And if any of these conditions are missed, then the vehicle will skip that parking lot altogether and just continue on their static route. So if you do notice, as you're watching the simulation run, if you notice a lot of vehicles just kind of skip all of those lots and just keep driving, most of the time that's either due to the space itself not being long enough to fully accommodate the length of the vehicle, or that parking space may be occupied and already have another vehicle assigned to it. So these are just a few things to keep in mind as you're watching the simulation run. All right, so from here, let's move over to our next topic, which is going to be about looking at different evaluations for the parking lot. So we touched a little bit on the parking lot groups a bit earlier, but essentially the parking lot groups are going to be used for evaluation purposes to just group together a defined set of parking lot objects. So this can be especially useful if you have different lots you kind of want to evaluate against each other, or maybe you have different levels of a parking garage and you kind of want to group all of those lots together for a particular level and then evaluate each of those kind of levels as a whole. So all of the parking lot group information can be found under the list menu. And then in here, if you go down to private transport, there'll be an option for parking lot groups. And when you have that selected, it's going to open up the window shown here at the bottom of the network editor. And this is where you can define additional parking lot groups. The groups themselves don't have a lot of attributes associated with them, essentially just a number and a name. So you can always add more by pressing that green plus button. And then you can, again, just name those or number them as desired. And you'll also see within this window, by default, the child list will be set to the parking lot. And then you can just quickly see over here on the right-hand side, all of the parking lots that are associated with that particular parking lot group. And if you do need to make any updates to the parking lots that are within those evaluation groups, you can update that attribute in the parking lot window that we kind of showed a bit earlier, or you can also do this in the parking lot list. This can be useful if you want to change a large group of parking lots all at once and kind of reassign those evaluation groups. But essentially within the parking lot list, you'll want to make sure that you've got the evaluation groups attribute added. By default, you'll see that this attribute's not shown. But again, if you go to that wrench icon, you can just search up that evaluation groups attribute and add it into the list here. And then once you've got that added, you'll see here there'll be a little drop-down icon that you can select if you want to change any of those evaluation group settings for a particular parking lot. And then prior to running the simulation, you'll also want to configure all of the relevant evaluation options. So this can all be done if you go back to that evaluation menu and then select configuration. In here is where you'll see a few different options for the parking lot. They're kind of grouped up here together in the middle of the Result Attributes tab. But essentially in here we've got options to evaluate the parking lot groups, the parking lots, the parking routing decisions, and the parking spaces. And like all of the other evaluation options, you can also set the from time to start the data collection and the to time to end that data collection, and then also the intervals over which to collect that data. And then the results for all of these can be found within that evaluation menu under the result list option. And in here, you'll see again another group for each of those different types of results. And once you choose any of these are going to open up a separate window in the bottom of the network editor that you can further view. So let's take a look at the parking lot group results first. And you'll see here we've got quite a few available attributes. And again, in this case, since we're looking at the parking lot groups, this will be results for all of the parking lots that are contained within that defined evaluation group. So in here we can see the, again, that parking lot group number and name. We can also see the number of vehicles that are currently parked within that time interval, as well as the number of vehicles that actually entered and parked during that time interval. We also have an attribute here for the number of vehicles that finished parking and then exited their spot. And then here we've kind of got a few different attributes regarding the amount of time that vehicles are parking. So in this case, this will be the total occupancy duration for all of the parking lots within those groups. And then we've also got the minimum parking duration, the maximum, and then also the average for each of the those parking lot groups. And then in here, you can also see the average occupancy rate for all of the parking spaces, the total duration of block time for any of those parking spaces. So this would occur if a vehicle is waiting to exit, but maybe the main traffic flow is a bit too heavy and those vehicles can't get out. So in that case, those spaces are going to be blocked and won't allow any other vehicles to park there. And in addition to the total block duration, you can also see the parking space blocked rate as well. And then finally, we also have the total of any parking fees associated with those parking lots. And then you'll see there are very similar attributes, essentially the same options again, that will be listed out for the parking lots as well. So in this case, since we're looking at parking lot results, instead of seeing overall results for a parking lot group, in this case, we'll see each result for the parking lot as a whole. So again, if you did have any parallel parking lots created with multiple spaces, this would be for the lot itself, taking into account each of those spaces. The main difference between this result window and the last one is that instead of having parking lot groups shown, in this case, we'll just have the parking lot number shown. And then kind of likewise for the parking spaces attributes. So in here again, instead of the parking lot number overall, we can see the parking space number. So the very first one will be the parking lot and then dash the parking space. So again, if you just have one parking lot with one space, that'll just be a single line item. But if you did have a parallel parking lot with multiple spaces, then you'd see things like 1-2, 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, etc. And again, all of the attribute values here are the same, so similar kind of results can be shown just on different levels. And then the final option here is for the parking routing decisions, and this one does contain some different results. So in here we can see the routing decision number along with the total number of parking requests. So this is just going to represent the total number of vehicles that passed that routing decision point. And then out of all of those requests, we can see the number of requests that were accepted. So this would be the number of vehicles that were actually able to park successfully. And then we can also see the number of declined requests, which again is going to be the number of vehicles that were unable to park because they didn't meet that list of parking requirements. So again, this could be anything from the vehicle being too long, or maybe all of the spaces are full and the vehicles are unable to park. So in this case, any of those declined requests will at least be tracked within the parking routing decision. So this is a really helpful option if you want to take a look after the simulation is run, just to see how many vehicles were unable to meet that parking request. And then in addition to the total number of declined requests, you can also see the declined percentage of parking requests as well, again, for those vehicles that weren't able to be allocated to a parking space. All right, so from here, let's also take a look at a few different graphic parameter options. Again, this can also be very useful for trying to visualize some of that parking information, as well as some of those results information, either after the simulation has run or even while the simulation is running. So the first kind of set of graphic parameters we wanted to talk about here is on the parking lots or the spaces. So if you go back to the Network Object toolbar and then navigate to that parking lot object, you can then open up the graphic parameters window by just clicking that little box that's shown next to the parking lots. And once that graphic parameters window is open, you can then go down here to the drawing mode and then the color scheme configuration. And by default, just the regular drawing mode is just going to use the display, the default display for those parking lots. So they're just going to show up with that blue border color just as a box. But in this case, if you want to actually change the color of the parking lot based on an attribute, maybe a result attribute, in that case, you'll want to change that drawing mode to the option Use Color Scheme. And then once you have that selected, directly below that is where you can configure and set up those attributes. So you'll just want to check if there'll be a little dot, dot, dot you can select next to that color scheme configuration. And once you've got that selected, this color scheme editor window will open up. And in here is where you can, at the top, set up the classification. So if you wanted to color by space or by lot or by parking lot group, you can choose one of those options up there. And then kind of in the middle is where you can select that attribute that you want to color by. Again, based on what you have selected here, there'll be a few different attributes that'll be allowed, again, just depending on what you have selected as the classification option. And in this case, what we have selected is the number of vehicles that are entering and going to be parking within those parking lots. And in this case, we're looking at the current time interval for the current simulation run for all of those vehicle types. And then in addition, at the very bottom is where you can set up any of those color schemes and boundaries. In this case, we've just selected one of the predefined options from the color wheel here, and then kind of updated some of these boundary settings. But again, this is very customizable, so feel free to create your own color schemes and create your own boundary conditions, just depending on what attribute that you're trying to view. And then once all of that has been configured and you've selected OK, you'll then start to see some of those color options change. So in this case, what we've got, again, is we're coloring the parking lots based on the number of vehicles that are parking in that space. within this current time interval. And you can see any of those darker green colors. These are going to be the ones that don't have as many vehicles. So you'll see here we've either got 2 or 1 or less parking in those spaces. Whereas this space here, which is kind of acting as more of a drop-off space, that one has a bit higher frequency of parking. You can see in that case, so far we've had 8 vehicles parked there during this current time interval. So again, this option just allows a lot of different customizations. So you can choose, again, any of those attributes that we looked at earlier within those results lists. And then it's just a nice way to be able to see how everything is kind of performing as the simulation is running or after that simulation has completed. And then the final option kind of related to the graphic side of things is on the vehicles themselves. So if you go to the vehicles and network option and then again edit those graphic parameters by clicking the box on the right hand side. In this case, all we'll need to do is change that drawing mode to color by parking state. And that'll just be an option here in the drop-down menu. And from here, there's no further configuration needed. Vissim automatically knows what the parking state is of a vehicle, and it'll automatically start to color the vehicles based on that state. And you can see in the image here on the right-hand side, up here at the top are the different parking states that are allowed for the vehicles. So you can see here any of the vehicles in the dark blue are ones that are currently parked and still dwelling. Anything in the light blue are vehicles that are in the process of parking, so they're driving to that parking space. You can also see the vehicles showing up as yellow here. These are the ones that have just backed out of their spaces and are going to be continuing going back to their static route and will continue on their journey. And then any of the green vehicles, these are completely unrelated to parking, so these are just continuing on their journey and won't be parking at all. There's also a few other options that are not shown here. So one is the orange option. This would be for any vehicles that have been assigned a space, but if it's still occupied, any of those vehicles that are waiting will be shown in orange. Any vehicles that are currently parked and trying to leave, but maybe the drive aisle is still full or the vehicle was unable to exit for some reason, those vehicles will show up as red just because they're blocked while they're leaving their space. And then any of the light purple vehicles represent any vehicles who were unable to park because their request was declined because they didn't meet one of those requirements. So this parking scheme is especially helpful when you're running the simulation if you're just looking to kind of see what everyone is doing and where vehicles are kind of going and where they are in the parking process. It's also useful if you're trying to troubleshoot or debug any vehicles that maybe aren't parking. If you see a few of those light purple vehicles kind of driving around, this just allows you to easily pick them out and you can kind of check all of those surrounding conditions to determine why those vehicles maybe skipped that parking decision altogether. All right, so that really wraps up all of our presentation materials for parking modeling. So let's go ahead and take a look at our example file here. All right, so in this case, we've just added a few parking spaces here. We've got a few more of the kind of longer term parking spaces here. You can see we've got those named. And then we also have a little drop-off parking space as well, just for vehicles to do a quick drop-off if they're dropping or picking up someone and then continuing on. And the real main difference between these two different types of parking lots is that the longer term ones, since the vehicles are driving in and then reversing out, those have that parking direction set to forward reverse, while as for the drop-off one, we'll have that one set to forward forward. That way the vehicles won't actually try to back up while they're leaving, but yet they'll, when they're done, they'll just continue driving forward. And then for each of these, we've got a couple of different routing decisions set up. So one is for the longer term parking. So this one is associated with all of these different parking lots here. You can see again, if you cycle through kind of that child list window on the right, this will just allow you to quickly see all the parking lots associated with that longer term space. And then also you can see the route. Again, you can adjust this if needed, if you're modeling a larger parking area with multiple options to get to a space. And then our other option here is for a drop-off parking space that's going to this particular this drop-off parking lot. One thing that we did do here is that this drop-off parking routing decision is located on a separate, smaller connector that we have a static route going over. So that way the vehicles who are going to the long-term parking also won't go to the drop-off parking. This will just kind of keep them separate so that the way those vehicles don't kind of overlap and do the same behavior. The other thing we have set up that's a bit different between those two spaces is that we have the drop-off parking has a bit of a shorter parking duration, whereas the longer term has a bit longer parking duration. Again, these are just pulling from the different time distributions that are set up in the model. So if you did want to add any additional ones, you can just go to the base data menu and then go to distributions and then time. And that will allow you to add in any additional distributions that you want to set up for those particular parking lots. And then the other difference between these two is that we've got that full occupancy behavior set. So in this case, for any of those drop-off spaces, we'll have the vehicles just wait, and then they will go to that particular lot. If it's currently full, they'll just wait behind it. Whereas for the longer-term parking, if all of these spots are full, instead of having vehicles wait, we'll just have them keep driving. That way they won't block this main aisle and cause any congestion. Okay. And then we also set up a couple of evaluation groups for these. So if you go to list and then private transport and then parking lot groups, you can see here where those two different parking lot groups are created. One for that drop off and then a group for that longer term. And again, this will be helpful if you do have different parking lots that you're modeling within one model and you want to gather evaluations for a group of parking lots as a whole. This will allow you to kind of get those separated out and then you can look at those results individually. So let's go ahead and we can play this here, let it initialize. And then we can start to see some of those vehicles going to these different spaces. What we've done here is we've got the vehicles, again, coloring by that parking state. So you can see this vehicle here is parking, whereas all of the other vehicles in the network that aren't going to be utilizing this parking area, those are all going to be showing up as green. And then again, if you did want to configure any of the options for the parking lots themselves to change any of those colors, again, all of that can be done in the parking lot graphic parameters. In this case, you'll just want to change that drawing mode to use color scheme, and then you can set up those attributes within this window here. And if I click on that attribute option, you can see again, we've got a lot of different options. So if you wanted to see the number of vehicles that were leaving a parking space or the total number that parked during that or were parked during that time interval, you can also pull out information again about the parking duration or the occupancy as well. And then again, you can set up, in this case, we're just using some of these predefined color schemes. But of course, you can click on any of these. You can change all of those color options. You can change those boundary settings as well. And let me go ahead and turn the graphics back on. In this case, we're starting the evaluations at 900 seconds. And a lot of these parking lots for the longer term, the vehicles are just leaving. So you'll see some of these colors will start to change as we get additional vehicles coming in. But basically, that color scheme will show up. Those parking lots will be colored based on that color scheme. One other thing that we did in here to include both of these in the legend is that we also chose that option within the graphic parameters. We just picked that legend include parking colors in here just so that that will be included so we can easily keep track of the number of vehicles that are entering the space. One other configuration the label does have within the parking lots is that you can turn on the number as well. So if you wanted to see the number visually as well as the color, you can turn that on or off here. All right, and then kind of the final thing that we want to take a look at is just using that built-in parking lot creator. So I'll go ahead and stop the simulation and I'll get that legend turned off. But essentially, if I just add a new link here really quickly, make that a bit longer. So whenever you have a link created, you can then go to that Create Car Park option. And then from here, you can just, again, just left click and drag, and you'll see those parking spaces will be automatically created. If you do have a link in the opposite direction, the spaces will automatically be created from that direction as well. And then once you kind of have some of those set up, again, for the most part, we tend to do most of the configuration within the GUI itself. Again, as you're moving things around, if you're rotating, you'll notice that these values in the table are also going to update based on what's being changed here graphically. So again, you can just use this to quickly rotate the spaces. You can lengthen them or widen them. And then you can also remove them if there was a couple of prohibited parking spots, you can turn those off. You can turn those back on at any time as well. Those will just show up with a hatched pattern. Again, you can also turn on any of that accessibility. So if you didn't want to allow vehicles to park to the left, you can click those arrows to turn that on or off. And then again, you can further configure things like the parking duration. You can change the parking rate as well. And then once you've got everything set up, you can just click OK, and we'll erase all the evaluations. That's okay. And let me just go ahead and lengthen this a bit more, put those spaces pretty close to the entry. But you'll see here we've got our parking routing decision created, going to each of those spaces. And then really once we have a route or have our vehicle input in place, and if we have a static route created for those vehicles to take, that's really all the configuration that's needed. We'll have all of those parking lots created. Change that back. So all the lots are created. Again, those reduced speed areas are created. And as we run the simulation, there'll be a whole group of priority rules that are also created. We've got those mostly turned off, but you'll see a lot of these will be just created here automatically. And you can see a lot of them have a super long name just depending on what they're tied to. But that's another nice feature, is that all of this conflict is kind of taken care of within Vissim.